G'day folks, welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about the Sabbath day, and I want to give you 100% proof that Christians are not required to keep the Sabbath day. Christians are not required to observe the Sabbath day. Now, my main text is going to be Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Now, I'm going to read this to you, but let me just quickly say that if you're a Seventh Day Adventist or a Seventh Day Baptist, you're going to have all sorts of objections in your mind to this passage, and you're going to try to say, well, this is talking about the festival Sabbaths and not the weekly Sabbath. I'm going to refute all of that, and I'm going to show you beyond a shadow of a doubt that this text says that the Christian is not required to observe the weekly Sabbath. If you want a copy of my notes, click on the link in the description below. There you'll have a Google form pop up. Put your name and your email, and then on the confirmation screen there'll be a link to all of my notes, including my notes here on this video on Colossians chapter 2 verse 16 to 17, and we go through all of the objections. We're going to go through them now. There's also notes to whether or not Adam kept the Sabbath. I've done a video on that in the past, but Adam did not keep the Sabbath day. In fact, every day for Adam was a day of rest, and I show that in that video as well as in my notes. But for now, let's get into this subject. Let me begin by reading Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. It says this: "Therefore, no one is to judge you in food and drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." Now, for most people, this verse is enough. This verse quite clearly says that nobody can judge you in regards to food and drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. It says very clearly here that these things are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance is Christ. And so for most people, this verse is a very clear passage of Scripture that says that Christians are not required to keep the Sabbath. But for the Seventh Day Adventist and the Sabbath Day Baptist and other Sabbath Day keepers, this verse is not enough to convince them that Christians are not required to keep the Sabbath. They argue that the reference to Sabbath day here is not referring to the weekly Sabbath day, but instead they argue that this is referring to a special festival Sabbath day and not the weekly Sabbath day. And they give a number of arguments to try to prove this point. The first argument they make is that the word is translated in the plural in the King James, Sabbath days. That's the first argument that they make. It's worth noting that the word used here that is translated as Sabbath day in this translation, which is the Legacy Standard Bible, the update to the New American Standard Version, the word in the Greek appears 68 times in the New Testament. 58 times it's translated as Sabbath day. 9 times it's translated as the first day of the week, the word week being Sabbath. So the first day of Shabbat. So in other words, the first day of the week. It's translated that way 9 times. And it's only translated in the plural once. In Acts chapter 17, verse 2, where Paul says, where it says in the book of Acts that Paul reasoned in the synagogue for 3 Sabbath days. Now that makes sense to translate it in the plural there because it's talking about 3 Sabbath days. But I think that the way this translation has translated it seems to be consistent with the way it's translated all through the New Testament. It's referring to the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day. Now, the second argument that they make is that every time these words, festival, new moon, or Sabbath day, every time these words appear together in the Old Testament, it's always referring to a special festival Sabbath day. Now, I want to show you that that is completely false. And anybody that tells you that has not looked at the passages in question. At least they haven't looked at them carefully. I'm going to show you without a shadow of a doubt that every time these 3 words appear together, they are referring to the weekly Sabbath. When it uses that word Sabbath day, it's referring to the weekly Sabbath day. First of all, it's worth noting that Leviticus 23. Now, Leviticus 23 is the chapter in Leviticus that lists all of the festivals in one chapter. And right at the beginning, it lists the weekly Sabbath. Let's go there together. Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. And you see right at the beginning, let me read to you verses 1 and 2 just to get the context of the chapter. The beginning of the chapter, it says this, "And Yahweh spoke again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the appointed times," and the King James says feasts, "the appointed feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these." And the very first one here listed is the Sabbath day. It says, "For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all of your places of habitation." And then as you keep reading, it lists all of the other feasts that Israel was commanded to observe. So verses 4 to 8 lists the Passover. Verses 9 to 14 is the Feast of Harvest. Verses 15 to 22 is the Feast of Weeks. Verses 23 to 32 is the Feast of Trumpets. And verses 33 to 44 is the Feast of Booths. So very clearly here, the Sabbath day, the weekly Sabbath, is included in the lists of feasts that Israel is to observe. This is very, very clear here. And as I said, anybody who has made that argument that the Sabbath day is referring to, in Colossians, is referring to some special feast, Sabbath day is completely wrong, because the weekly Sabbath is included in the feasts of Israel themselves. So that argument must be dismissed on that basis alone. The second thing is this. I think it's 4 times from memory. I've got 4 listed. There may be more, but I'm pretty sure it's 4, that these 3 things, the festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths, are listed together. Every time they appear, it's very clearly referring to the weekly Sabbath. 3 of them, the first one is the establishment, or 2 of them actually, are the establishment of Solomon's temple. We'll look at that in a moment. The second one is the temple that was established in Ezra. It's described in Nehemiah. That's the passage we're going to look at, where these 3 are listed together. And then, of course, it's listed in the building of Ezekiel's temple, a future temple which is to come. And then, of course, it's listed in Hosea, which we'll look at as well. But it's interesting to note that the majority of these times that these words are listed together, it's at the building of one of the temples, okay? And when it's listed, it's describing the entire sacrificial ministry of the Levites. Let me read it to you. If we go to 1 Chronicles to look at the first one, 1 Chronicles chapter 23. 1 Chronicles, I'm going too far here. 1 Chronicles chapter 23. 1 Chronicles chapter 23, beginning at verse 30, and this is referring to the service of the Levites at the temple that Solomon is about to build. It says this, "And they are to stand every morning to thank and to praise Yahweh, and likewise at evening, and to offer all burnt offerings to Yahweh on the Sabbaths, the new moons, and the appointed times, in the number set by the judgments concerning them, continually before the Lord." This is describing the entire sacrificial ministry of the Levites, the priests and the Levites, in the temple that Solomon is about to build. Have a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 2. 2 Chronicles chapter 2, beginning at verse 4, it says this, "Behold I," referring to Solomon, "behold I am about to build a house for the name of Yahweh my God, setting it apart to him as holy, to burn fragrant incense before him, to set out the showbread continually, and to offer burnt offerings morning and evening, on Sabbaths, and on new moons, and on the appointed feasts of Yahweh our God, this being required forever in Israel." Notice here that this is a description of the entire sacrificial ministry, a summary of the entire sacrificial ministry of the priests and Levites. Every morning, every Sabbath, every new moon, and every single feast, they are to offer sacrifices. When all 3 of these are listed together, it's clearly here, especially in context, seen to be a reference to the weekly Sabbath. And this will be abundantly clear when we look at Ezekiel's temple. But let's look at Nehemiah chapter 10 to see the next temple, the second temple, Nehemiah chapter 10, beginning at verse 32. And this, of course, is when the people of God are promising to keep Yahweh's laws, promising to obey God's laws. And this, of course, includes the work of the priests and the Levites in the sacrifices that were to be given at the temple. It says this, and it's very much the same as what we read in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, in regards to the first temple. It says this, we also set ourselves under the commandments to give yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, for the continual grain offering, for the continual burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moon, and the appointed times, appointed feasts, for the holy things, and for the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and all the work of the house of our God. Very clearly here, this is a summary of the sacrificial work of the priests and Levites. It lists the Sabbath days, the new moons, and appointed times, the appointed feasts, clearly in context of the overall context of what's going on. The weekly Sabbath is included here. Let's have a look at Ezekiel's temple, the third one, Ezekiel 45. Verse 17. And this is really describing the role of the prince to come. The role of the prince to come in providing burnt offerings for all of the sacrifices that will take place at the new temple, the temple known as Ezekiel's temple. It says this in verse 17, Ezekiel 45, verse 17. It shall be the prince's part to provide the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the drink offerings at the feasts, on the new moons, and on the Sabbaths, and all the appointed times of the house of Israel. He shall provide the sin offering, the grain offering, the burnt offering, and the peace offerings to make atonement for the house of Israel. Now, just a few verses later, it starts to go into the application of this. Chapter 46, and remember, there are no chapter and verse divisions in the original text. This is just a few verses later. Chapter 46, verse 1, it says this, Thus says Lord Yahweh, the gate of the inner court facing the east shall be shut the 6 working days, but it shall be opened on the Sabbath day, and opened for the day of the new moons. Then the prince shall enter by way of the porch of the gate from the outside, and stand by the post of the gate. Then the priests shall provide his burnt offering, referring to the offering supplied by the prince, as it says in verse 17, a few verses earlier. Then the priest shall provide his burnt offering and his peace offerings, and he shall worship at the threshold of the gate, and then go out, but the gate shall not be shut until evening. Very clearly here, this is referring to the weekly Sabbath. So earlier in verse 17, when it says the priest is to supply all of the sacrifices for the new moons, the Sabbaths, and appointed times, the appointed feasts, it clearly included the weekly Sabbath, because the context, when we get to verse 46, that shows the application of that clearly specifies the weekly Sabbath. So to me, this argument that when you see these 3 listed together, it's referring only to some special festival Sabbath, that argument is very weak in light of the context. Hosea chapter 2 verse 11 is the other one that they use, Hosea chapter 2 verse 11. And the context here in Hosea chapter 2 verse 11 is really the judgment of God. The judgment of God. And God going to bring an end, of course, for a time, because Israel returned to the land, to the new moons, the feast, the new moons, and the Sabbaths. It says this, Hosea chapter 2, verse 11, it says, I will also cease all her joy, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed times, all her appointed feasts. This is speaking about a time of God's judgment where he was going to bring an end to all of this stuff. For a period of time, of course, he was going to bring an end to all of this stuff. And it's not referring to just some special Sabbath day. It's referring to the weekly Sabbath as well. All of the Sabbaths, all the feasts, all the new moons, and all the Sabbaths were going to come to an end because of God's judgment upon the people of Israel. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to Colossians and read this text in light of all of that, so that we can see very clearly what this passage is all about. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, it says, Therefore, no one is to judge you. In fact, if we just go a few verses earlier, we can really see the context of it. It says in verse 13, And you being dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive with him, having graciously forgiven us all of our transgressions, having cancelled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us. He has also taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Having disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them in him. Therefore, no one is to judge you in food and drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. These things are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Clearly, Christians are not required to keep the Sabbath day. Very clearly here, the festivals, new moons and Sabbaths, the fact that they're all listed together means it includes the weekly Sabbath, because when you look at it in the Old Testament, it's always inclusive of the weekly Sabbath. These things are a shadow of things to come. The substance is Christ. The Sabbath day is a picture of our salvation by faith, by resting in Jesus Christ and what He has done instead of trusting in our own works. And if you read Hebrews chapter 4, you'll see that that's what that chapter is all about. I hope you've liked this video. If you have, please consider subscribing, hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comment section and you'll see me in my next video.